Okay, so we can start now. Everything's in place. I'm happy to welcome Professor Jeffrey Schein, who is visiting us for approximately 5 weeks. Jeffrey is the director of the Master's Program in Jewish Education at the Siegal College in Cleveland. And while in Israel, he'll be working on revisiting the central construct of his Reconstructionist educational work, which deals with values of spiritual peoplehood. And for him, this is an opportunity for us to get to know his work and maybe to react to it.
Of course.
So the weeks he's going to be with us, I'm sure he will be meeting us separately and trying to gain from whatever is it we can offer. Jeffrey, please.
תודה רבה. אז אני אתחיל בעברית, שמח מאוד, מרגש מאוד לדבר עברית ברחוב ובשוק, אבל בענייני עיון ומושג, שפת אם שלי זה אנגלית. טוב, אז אני אחליף לאנגלית בשתי דקות. אבל בהתחלה, המון תודה להאוי דיצ'ר, בשביל השיחות הראשונות על ההזדמנות לבוא למלטון, ולספי בקרמן על השיחות האחרונות לזוז מאפשרות לסמינר הזה ו5 שבועות פה ללמוד וללמד עם צוות מלטון. אני שמח מאוד. לא אחרון חביב, אבל אני צריך לומר תודה Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture and for the new Center for the Study of Mordecai Kaplan and Peoplehood that Mel Skult and Eric Kaplan and Dan Cederbaum have established, because in different ways they're sponsors of the project. Okay, so in general, I'm going to do a couple hakdamot, sort of frame what we'll be going through, run through a PowerPoint, where I'll be, skimming the surface of 5 challenges that I'm looking into. And then we'll take a hafsakah, a bit of a break, and give you a chance to read through the choveret, something that might be most aligned with your special interest. We'll come back and have questions. And then I have a she'ela gedola, a big question for you. In general, there's 3 stages of this project that the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture is sponsoring 2 and the Kaplan Center the 3rd. The first is to be here and sharpen the focus and the intellectual and educational yesodot, the foundations of what I'll be doing over the course of time. The second phase is back in Cleveland, where I'm now at the Jewish Education Center of Cleveland, a partner organization for Siegal, in my 22 years there. I'll be meeting with people who are graduates of the master's program at Siegal, who have become not my students anymore, but my colleagues and fellow professionals, and we'll be sitting down, and as I produce a chapter or a piece of writing, they'll be critiquing it. So that's a second stage, and the third stage will relate to my big question for you, but will take me well into semi-retirement. And it's a big project. It's a project to last for a number of years. It's designed to be portable. So when Deborah, my wife, and I move to Minneapolis, and you'll see the reason why, it's part of the PowerPoint, it's inevitable, that we'll have something really interesting to keep us very busy in semi-retirement, or as Vicki Kelman and the West Coast folks like to call it, rewirement stage of life. Okay. Rewirement. They like that. It's a very California, right? In California, I learned last week at a seminar I was part of that it's become an acceptance part of their parlance that whenever you're doing something, you look for cool kids. Well, cool kids are people who think outside the box, who aren't part of the mainstream, and you can't get a grant from a San Francisco foundation unless you've gone through that process of vetting it with cool kids. Interesting. Okay. So I'm going to start with the story, which explains why I'm doing things a little differently today than I imagined a few days ago. And it's a vintage Mordecai Kaplan story. And I think it's true because I've seen it documented in a number of different places. And it goes like this. that when Kaplan was teaching his class on homiletics at the Jewish Theological Seminary, he would meet with each individual student and he'd go over what they intended to present. And they would, being young rabbinical students, they would take copious notes and they would come back on Thursday, 2 days later, and give the exact talk that Kaplan asked them to give, and he would tear it to shreds and they would be totally crestfallen. And they would go up to him and say, "But Professor Kaplan, this is what you told me to do." And he would say, maybe you know the punchline, "That was Tuesday, today's Thursday, I've evolved." So I received another sort of twist on that the other day when I met Howie at the Xerox machine, and he was taking the plans for one of his classes they had laid out carefully over a couple-week period, and he was busily saying, "Nope, this isn't going to work, I'm going to change this." All this reminds me of Lawrence Hoffman's wonderful comment about tefillah, that don't think it's classical music, it's jazz. Good pedagogy is highly improvisational. And so, as I thought, really after meeting with Michael and Hallie for a very fine meeting a couple days ago, it dawned on me that there were two gaps in my presentation, and without filling those in, I couldn't get the kind of response or the invitation to dialogue that I'd like to offer you. So one is about myself. I should say a few words so you'll know where I'm coming from and where I am at this stage of life and my professional career. So I grew up in a small Reform congregation outside of Pittsburgh, a place called Temple David in Monroeville. There was a wonderful rabbi there. I remember very well his coming back in the early 60s from being in the South, as many rabbis were, fighting for civil rights, and his first Rosh Hashanah sermon. And Jason Edelstein, whose claim to fame is he has established for rabbis the rabbinic hotline for rabbis in stress. There was no outlet for them in the Reform movement. He had a clinical background. Wonderful human being. Somehow, he's produced 8 Reform rabbis and 1 lone Reconstructionist rabbi. That's me. And it was a place that gave me some strong connections to Judaism, but they felt rather evanescent by the time, and ephemeral by the time I was an adolescent. I would say I had not become alienated from Judaism, but I certainly drifted from Judaism. And I'm now, in the unfolding tale, a sophomore at the University of California at Santa Barbara. I've met a certain young woman who's been my life partner across the way during that year. And I'm intent on going abroad for a year. And I think Sweden is a very cool place to go to because I'm a social democrat by instinct and nature, and I think it's such an interesting society. And it must have been a bot-kol, really, of some sort or another that said to me, "Jeffrey, you may stay a liberal all your life, but your interest in Swedish democracy is fairly ephemeral. You're going to be a Jew all of your life." And I heard that voice, and so I was among the first group, we were still at Givat Ram, from the University of California that came on the Year Abroad program. Okay. That year abroad was absolutely formative for everything about me. Kasher ani ba lehachnisa ha'ir achshav. When I come to the entrance of the city, Ayin lo letzion Sophia. I'm not looking straight ahead to Har Habayit or the Kotel. Ani poneh v'mistakel l'sof ha'marav, to the far west, to Har Herzl, to Yad Vashem, and most of all to Kiryat Yovel, where I spent that year and where Deb and I have family. But it was an extraordinary year, and the most significant single influence on me was Michael Rosenack, who was teaching Ivrit Kala in the Institute for Contemporary Studies, but had the good sense to dispense with whatever chok that was. It was supposed to be an easy Hebrew. He let go of it very quickly, because you all know Michael, that he was interested in the dialogue and the issues and the theory and the theology. As with Eric Kaplan, who I'll say a word about in the project that Eric and I are working with, he told us we ought to read more Kaplan, even though Kaplan was theologically very far from Rosenack's thinking. We both did. He became a member of the Jewish Reconstructionist Federation Board and the author of a very important book on the liturgy of Mordecai Kaplan, the new prayer book, and I became a Reconstructionist rabbi. I completed my doctoral work at Temple University and have spent 15 years as a Menahel, as a Reform and Conservative Principal, Education Director, 5 years in central agencies, 28 years as an academic, either at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College or Siegal College. At Siegal, the job was to guide, by the end of that time, over 100 students through the master's program. And I was 20 years the National Education Director for the Reconstructionist movement. Now, do I look like I'm 92 years old to you? Good. I am glad. The reason is that some of those jobs, as Israelis will really appreciate, were double jobs, nighttime jobs, second jobs. But it's been a really wonderful career. So that's something about me that will, I think, help you assess some of the ideas I'll put forward. And now I want to say just a word about, turn this light off, and I'm going to move back to, oh my God, it's working. How about that? About what's up here, the values of spiritual peoplehood. I want to say in the beginning, I don't know if our discussions will take us there. I imagine some of the side meetings that I'll have with each of you will, but each of those three words can easily and importantly be problematized, right? Peoplehood sounds as good as mom and apple pie. If we had some criterial attributes of what constitutes peoplehood, we would not be having this messy, in some ways pathetic discussion around the new Pew study. It's the Pew study, Jewish population study of North America, which sort of has put us back to where we were in the 90s, when the 1990 population. It's a dispiriting dialogue in many, many different ways. J.J. Goldberg just came out with an article that someone sent me that said, I want to say the study is wrong. No, the interpretation, the study is wrong. I don't want to say wrong interpretation. It's just plain wrong. Anyway, I'm not an expert in demography, but I do know that if we knew better what peoplehood was, we would have a much more productive event. So peoplehood could be problematic. Spirituality, I understand some of you want me to take it out of the construct. I'm going to keep it there, most likely, though I'm open to argument. In part, I must say, over the last 7 years, I've watched my wife work very hard to reintroduce the notion of spirituality into early childhood discourse, both in Jewish education and in general. And I think it's important, but it's a lot of work. It's not muvan me'elav what it means. And similarly, I want to say the same about values. All three words can be problematized, which I'm not going to do later in the lecture, but I want you to know that I'm aware of that. How can values be problematized? Well, as in my talk with Michael and Hallie, one thing one can do is to say the values that you're looking at in a moment, and I'll have something to say about. You know, if you look at it from the perspective of Leibovitz, they're manifestations of something more fundamental, namely Ol Malchut Shemayim. There's something that underlays them. That's one way in which values can be, problematic. One can also quote Kohelet here, as he said, "Asot sefarim harbe ein kates." Making many books there is no end. Asot rishimot harbe ein kates. These lists are highly idiosyncratic. What I once tried to compare a half dozen different lists of Jewish values, and what makes it into one person's canon and what gets put out, don't know. And I am a devoted lover of some of the work of Thomas Green, who is not as well known as some other analytic philosophers doing education. He's certainly not as well known as R.S. Peters, but he's a brilliant educator, and he builds out of Alistair MacIntyre's insights and argues that the whole conversation about values education and education is mistaken because you only have the conversation when the organic linking of role and responsibility has been severed, and then you have language in search of context, and he's particularly hard on values clarification, though Kohlberg had demolished them in the 80s in his own way. But any kind of talk of values, he thinks, is sidestepping more fundamental issues. So I'm aware of those things. I just want you to be aware that as I move through and treat values of spiritual peoplehood as relatively uncomplicated, that there are words and issues related to each of those three words. Okay, so I'm going to start moving through the PowerPoint. We'll go back to the beginning. So how the values of spiritual peoplehood come about, how the term originate. This goes back to the early 80s when Jacob Staub, a professor of philosophy and a great Gersonity scholar and a theorist of modern Jewish life as well, my good friend and colleague and I were working on a book called Creative Jewish Education. And I forgot I'm in Israel where the arrows mean something else. And the book in its initial stages was a collection and a commissioning of work around fundamental Reconstructionist concepts. Living in two civilizations, tradition has a vote but not a veto, the relationship to Israel, the vitality of peoplehood. We were searching for educational embodiments that made you feel like, okay, whatever Johnny and others mean when they talk about the translation of a philosophy into new kinds of materials, this passed that test, at least in some intuitive way. They were good translations of Kaplanian thought and Reconstructionism. Near the end of that process, when Jacob and I are ready to write the conclusion, we end up as strange bedfellows with Charles Liebman. Charles Liebman, I think some of you know his work much better than I, is a sociologist and a scholar who writes in the 1968 American Jewish Yearbook what was then perhaps the classic study about Reconstructionism, which was then an unfolding movement. The Rabbinical College had just been established. There were 30 congregations that called themselves Reconstructionists. And Liebman goes very deeply into matter, and he says, well, here's what I want to say about Reconstructionism and Kaplanian thought. That if I were to put up on a screen the fundamental beliefs about Jewish life and Jewish identity, and I would randomly bring in people from the street, I would have more people identify with those sets of beliefs than with Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox, because Kaplan captures the folk religion, the folk elements of Jewish tradition. He's critical about other aspects, but he believes, like Michael Rosenack, that Kaplan's in the genius with his sociological approach at capturing what Jewish connection and peoplehood mean. And we get in bed with Liebman because we're dissatisfied with that. We think the folk element needs to be in dialogue with the more elite elements, which we define as the spiritual nature of peoplehood, the drachim, the Jewish paths that come out of Jewish connection. And we thought we were engaging in some sort of entirely new process when we name the values that you see here. We know they're traditional Jewish values, but a colleague of ours later went back to Judaism as a civilization, carefully read the 6 criteria by which we would judge the success of Jewish education in North America and said, you're really just building out of Kaplan's language. You weren't giving us a chidush. And I think they were right. So when I think about that work, the capturing of what an embodiment of Reconstructionist philosophy would look like in Jewish education, and our critique that at this point in time, it was important that we switch our focus from peoplehood to spiritual peoplehood as a construct. We hoped we were breaking some new ground. And when I look at this construct, now 35 years old, or 32 years old, I move into a kind of Deweyan reverie, remembering myself that Dewey is very attuned to the dual etymology of the word values, and that it means both to praise and appraise, and out of that, finally, to formulate new ends and views. It's a threefold process. I take some pleasure in the fact that this construct has such a robust history within the Reconstructionist movement, and in some ways has built the educational resources of the movement. I'll say just a word about those as we to make it concrete. In the 80s were the age, moving into the 90s, of grant go rare it grant. Right? There was lots of money for people who wanted to do new things in Jewish education. So the process went something like this. My student at RRC, Rabbi Dan Ehrenkrantz, who later went on to be the president of RRC, just recently retired, was very excited about this chapter of the book and the construct of the values of spiritual peoplehood. And he received the grant from the Metro West Foundation for his congregation, B'nai Keshet, to create an integrated set of programs around these values that equally valued and integrated family learning, student learning, and adult learning. So that was the grant that allowed us to begin writing curricular materials. In the early 90s, we're fortunate enough in the movement, I was then the education director, to receive a major grant from Covenant Foundation to take this approach that was developed at B'nai Keshet and establish a network of 13 cooperating schools. I intentionally, even though I understand and appreciate a great deal of the rhetoric and the focus of things like the experiment in congregational education, where to say school is asur, because you're really talking about something bigger, I think school is a fairly honored entity. I was glad to call it cooperating schools. And these 13 congregations, the rabbis and educators banded together, and they each, the way I explained it to them is that your congregation has an inherent sense of spirituality, of Jewish values, and you're very much better off, in my estimation, building your educational program around what's magnetized for you, what draws you and expresses the core of your Jewishness most creatively. And so these 13 congregations each took on different values. They worked together to generate the programs, and they flourished. They became part of the materials, the resources, and the network that emerged. If you were to go to Google and look at Growing Together, Amazon, you'd find an arrow that would take you inside, and you would find inside the volume probably the thickest and perhaps the most important essay there is the description of the integrated program of family, adult, and children's learning at B'nai Keshet that was the flagship for this whole network of cooperating schools. And it's there's some quite depth there. And again, so I'm being not overly abstract, I'll give you the thumb of a few of those activities and perhaps explain why they seem to create and generate excitement in terms of being good education. I think that's actually the hatchila. That they were good Reconstructionist education, well, that was good too. But here's just a couple quick examples. In relationship to Hidur Mitzvah, there's a wonderful opening project for families in the Gimel year, where we were fortunate enough to be able to bring in our friend, the famous graphic artist Betsy Plapkin-Teutsch, to be with the congregation. She lived in Philadelphia, they're in New Jersey, and they begin the year by having discussions at home about what ritual object has special meaning to their family. They bring it in, they present to one another, that becomes a kind of ongoing museum, and then they are connected as families to other resources, to people who do Chanukiot, an extraordinarily exquisite ways as they actualize the value of Hidur Mitzvah. That's the thumb of one of the projects. Talk about one more, because it has to be of interest to folks here at Melton, and that is the project around Sionut in the 5th grade, the 3rd year of their curriculum. So perhaps the single program that's had the biggest run outside the Reconstructionist movement is a simulation that I developed in the long time ago, in the 70s, around the Sixth Zionist Congress. And this is the beginning of the Sionut curriculum for the families. They're brought together and they simulate 1903. They're visited by Herzl. They have to develop an understanding of what the tensions were within Zionism. And of course, in terms of experiential learning, it's not simply talked about, but they stage that debate. It's recreated. They make banners. They do all that one would do at camp in schools. I don't think there's a difference there. And it's quite a wonderful beginning. But that, for me, is not the keter. I'm going to tell you what I think is the keter of this process. Parents are indeed learning how, as they learn to represent to their children. That's part of the magic and the art of family education. We spent some good time there. But this is a program, this integrated approach, that prizes adult learning as well and refuses to reduce parents, even though a significant role is as the parent and the head of the family unit. They are also independent adult learners. So I have on a tape, a very old tape, the parents gathering together. They've had the simulation of the Sixth Congress. They've had one more program. And they're sitting down, and what a magnificent machloket begins to emerge. First of all, they've read A.B. Yehoshua and Martin Buber to get many portraits of their Zionism. And there's two tensions in the room. One person who's very sophisticated gets up in the middle of the talk and says, you know what? We here as American Jews are misconstruing Zionism. We're making it about Israel and the United States. And she takes out this big poster of the Fourth World Zionist Congress, and you see all these people. This is a worldwide Jewish phenomena. It's a very smart lady and a very good piece of dialogue, but the treasure for me, and again, this is all about stimulating dialogue, is when one of the people say, you know, I just think that we get an awful lot of Israel focus here. You should know that the family educator is now the director of Young Judea, a gentleman named David Weinstein, and the Eti Siegal was the director. She's Israeli, and they do. And she says, you know, I think when they do Hatikva, they treat Hatikva as if it's as important as Aleinu. Now, if you know Reconstructionist theology, you know this is fraught with irony, because Aleinu is one of the prayers that gets modestly reformed. So that she should think Aleinu is a cornerstone, unreconstructed of their synagogue is interesting. But the dialogue and the passion around, you know, what's our connection to Israel and what's Ahavat Tzion is very real. And I think what I most value about the project is in venues in the United States that I've worked in, the great enemy is parveness, is when dialogue is not engaged and it becomes too easy, too assimilated, and not passionate. So this passion is part of what I think is most important, here. So we're going to move on a bit now.
Do you want questions in the end?
I'll take a few questions now.
I didn't understand your basic concepts of what you call spiritual peoplehood.
Okay.
I didn't write, I think I try to get it from the examples, but I'm not sure what you mean.
Okay.
And secondly, what I didn't grow up in America, so you can see from my non-American accent.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure, what really happened. I clearly understand that these educational programs created a tremendous level of interest and excitement.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of educational impact, how do you define success?
Okay.
And was there
Very
any
good.
evaluation?
Yes.
What happened to these people who were part of the program? For instance, the example that you gave, out of the synagogue that you were in, were 8 rabbis, and you were,
Right. Excellent, Jonathan. I'm going to hold on the first question because I think will become a little clearer later what we mean, but the second one I was going to skip, but now I won't. The program was evaluated twice. In 1995, Leora Isaacs, who was working for the Covenant Foundation, sat down with members of the congregation and with parents and evaluated the program. It received a very positive evaluation based on surveys and interviews. And the thing that they seemed to most appreciate was that it allowed for family dialogue, that the programs in their totality, and also from the parent's perspective, the fact that they were coming in and spending 10 hours during the year learning with the kids and independently, and their words meant that they were walking the walk as well as talking the talk. I re-interviewed some of those same parents in 2007 as I was preparing to come to the Oranim Mandel Conference on Multiple Identities in Jewish Education, so I wanted to see what had happened with them. Well, the programs were still there. I have a gnawing feeling that programs grow stale after 5 or 10 years. These have been going on for 20 some. And what I learned from those interviews is that the congregation itself had gone through a process of thinking that this was no longer just for the children or even for the families and the children, but each year they established a thematic thread for the learning of the congregation built on one of these values. So if it's, to give you a short answer to what does it mean, if the value of the year is Tikkun Olam, they're certainly studying classical texts from Tanakh and from rabbinic literature and from Kabbalistic literature about what Tikkun Olam means, but they're also heightening their efforts to engage in that as a community, and they're creating new outlets to the rest of the community so that this value becomes not only limud, which is important, but also ma'aseh. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope it will become clearer and just a bit. So, okay, that's the first part of my Deweyan reverie. I feel very good about these programs. It's a nice Yerusha to leave behind. Oh, you know what? I didn't do perhaps something very important. The program keeps morphing as it takes on new forms. So it started in one congregation, it became a major center for many Reconstructionist congregations and other congregations as well. Up until 2002, the Reconstructionist movement doesn't have a camp. That's another kind of paradox or irony given everything that Mordecai Kaplan writes about in Judaism as civilization. But I work hard with a couple of brilliant informal educators to help establish the Reconstructionist camp, and the educational grounding for the camp becomes the chugim that are established around the values of spiritual peoplehood, where people choose. It's a chug, and depending on your own spiritual inclinations, your Jewish inclinations, you're joining one or the other. But something else wonderful happens at camp, as often happens at camp. It takes on a new dimension. So Rabbi Jeff Eisenstadt, the head of the camp and my good colleague, every Friday afternoon becomes Reb Yankel. Reb Yankel comes and visits the kids, and they have a dialogue about these values that they've been experienced during the week, and he guides them through it. Being very campy, they also establish hand motions for each of the values. But it has another rebirth of energy and utilization within the Reconstructionist movement, which feels very good. I'm glad for that. I am, in the Deweyan sense, prizing what this has done. But at the same time, I want to and need to move into the second Deweyan phase, right, to appraise against a higher standard what those are like in order to create some ends in view and some future motion, which is really what I'll be working on with some of you and way beyond. So I now want to talk with you about the 5 challenges that I see to this construct that grew up in the 80s. And given their vitality and what I think is their substantial educational nature, I don't want to give up on them. That's easy enough to do. You could go on to some other constructs, and God knows we have enough things happening that you could always be focusing for the new. In this case, I think the old is substantial, but titchadesh, it needs to be renewed. So I have 5 challenges, and this is really related to the work I'm doing with many of you while I'm here. So my method is going to be, I'll say a few words about each of the challenge so that you can have a sense of it. You'll have a chance if I manage my time well, which I hope to go and read something related to ask some deeper questions. And if we don't have time at the seminar, certainly in the follow-up we'll be able to do that. And there's one I will go into in some greater depth. So the first challenge I would call foundational, and it relates to work that Eric Kaplan from McGill and I have begun to do. We're hopeful that we will submit a really good article that will be accepted to the issue of the Journal of Research in Jewish Education. It's going to be devoted to Michael Rosenack. Remember, we are both people who were really guided to Jewish education and reconnected with Jewish life by Michael. We've both taught Michael. He probably took the saner path in teaching mostly the conceptual guide to Jewish values. I taught for many years rabbinical students from Commandments and Concerns, and have worked with family educators to help them understand the different framings of ritual and the meaning of ritual that happens when you take his implicit or explicit understanding of religion and use that as the way that you work with people. Eric and I are very excited. We've had one talk. We're Skyping tomorrow. We're beginning to go through the Kaplan and Rosenack canon in terms of education. Kaplan's a little easier here than Rosenack. We'll certainly be selective. And we have a chush about 2 things. One is that in relation to Kaplanian theology and Kaplanian thought, that Kaplan has in my mind, a kind of dual legacy, a conservative and radical side to him. The conservative side comes from, and he has multiple influences, right? Comes, I think, from Durkheim, in the sense of belonging to the group is critically important. It's a rather conservative hermeneutic and understanding if one studied Durkheim. But he's also B'nai Dewey. He's one of the many people who have inherited Dewey. That's the radical side. I think that Reconstructionist thought in general will be in better shape if it recognizes this as a tension and a creative tension rather than just sort of taking the eclectic blend as a totality. Even more, I have a sense in relation, I think a lot of this article will focus on text study and the way each views text study. And here is my initial push, I hope, in my study with Michael and Howie and Johnny to get much further into this. But my sense is that they all recognize Schwab. Schwab's critically important to me. But Michael lets go of the milieu, that commonplace, in favor, I just had this discussion with Danny Marome, he more or less agrees, in favor of the power of the text. The power of the text with a proper reference to the student commonplace, to the voice and the life situation of the person, can be powerful. Kaplan, I don't think, is willing to do that. Kaplan's challenge is involved in the word Reconstructionism. Reconstruct your communities, build groups and vital places where those texts live, and without that, you won't do the dance of the Schwabian commonplaces the way that one might like. Anyway, I'm very excited to be working with Eric. That's challenge number 1. Number 2, I will say more about this a little bit. John Dewey, Experiential Learning, Adim Steinsaltz, and the Amphibious Jew. That's quite a mouthful. It'll become more concrete. In the packet, the one thing I've put is, in relationship to this challenge, is the article I wrote for E-Jewish Philanthropy several weeks ago, a month or so ago, when at New Cage there was a debate that David Steiner was really sort of fun, likened to the Thriller in Manila, the 1970 Joe Frazier Muhammad Ali debate, but this time it's not boxers, it's Danny Lehman versus David Breifman on the nature of experiential learning. And I thought it was a wonderful debate, really a very good one, but I weigh in that article from a Dewey perspective, quoting Herb Kleibart, that in the end, Dewey forced to choose between the psychologic of the learner, between the value of experience and the logic of the disciplines, refuses to do that and searches for a reality to which each belong. And I also reference that to a project that's very ongoing in Cleveland around philosophical inquiry and Parshat Shavua, with philosophical inquiry that Jen Glasser and I are doing together, which accounts for why she's in our house in Cleveland and I'm in her house in Jerusalem. I may have gotten the better of that deal. Anyway, that's in relationship to experiential learning. Again, that's the beginning, not the end of the matter. I'll get to it. Can you? Oh, I even have a slide of what he looks like. Okay. So, 21st century technology. I'm going to go light on this. I had a little more to say. That's a picture from Marshall McLuhan's, not the median is the message. That's how we read it. Median is the massage. It massages our neurobio connections, changes who we are. And he has this very famous saying and picture that we drive into the future using only our rear view mirror. The person who helped develop this PowerPoint didn't like the Bonanza stagecoach in the background, so he used a little bit of Northeast Ohio Amish background. But you see, we're supposed to be going forward, and the only way we go forward is with the images from the past. That's an enormous challenge. In the materials I'm preparing, it's related. Johnny, hope we have a chance to read this. I have been writing for and co-editing a Festschrift for Lifsa Schachter, my dear colleague who retired about 4 years ago. And in the Festschrift, I have Mordecai Kaplan and Franz Rosenzweig visiting contemporary Jewish education. It's based on my class on 4 visions of Jewish education I've used. There are cameo performances by Martin Buber and Abraham Joshua Heschel, but at the end of this debate, which is referenced to 10 challenges, what I consider 10 enduring challenges that I use to have my students then look at through the lenses of the four thinkers, Joe Schwab shows up uninvited and says, my God, you've had this whole debate without one reference to technology. Don't you understand how critical the milieu is? And then, Buber gets a little ruffled that you can't do I and thou through Facebook in this sort of Jewish time machine. Kaplan says, it's okay, we can do that. Anyway, whatever those challenges are to meet them, to make that more concrete. In the year 2000, Jeff Eisenstadt, my colleague, and Deb's on this trip, we bring a group of families to Israel for a trip based on the values of spiritual peoplehood. So when we're exploring Hiddur Mitzvah, we're going to art centers in Israel. When we're experiencing Kedusha, we're going to traditional and Kol HaNeshama type places. When we did that trip, the internet was alive enough so that each family had the responsibility of looking ahead while they were in the States to one place we were going to visit and preparing the group. That was with very primitive technology. What would that look like now with the amazing sets of resources? That's the kind of thinking that I think I need to do and others around the values of spiritual peoplehood. Okay. So those two I call fundamental, the bottom 2 fundamental challenges. The foundations, the 3 on top, I think are, I call them environmental changes. They're changes in the environment through which we move that need to be addressed as well. They're not as foundational, but they're equally important. So, 21st century challenge. The whole values of spiritual peoplehood complex has Jewish texts in...
decided to speak about the introduce you later.
Yeah, is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay, maybe the title's engaged you, so we'll get to him.
Not maybe.
Yeah, okay, you'll see. So, were I to do this curriculum at later points of my career, it would reflect my deeper appreciation of how central Jewish texts are, and to quote Robert Scholes, how textuality is itself an important value. And so in your packet, you'll see me going through a little cheshbon hanefesh about when I established my first lifelong learning program in 1979, there was nothing about Jewish texts there because my environment was such that wasn't what people were thinking about. Fast forward about 22 years, there's a group of rabbis coming to Cleveland for a rabbinic convention, and I'm absolutely terrified that the offerings I've put together don't have enough Jewish texts. That's how much the appreciation of Jewish texts has soared on the educational scene in a reasonable and important sort of way that Melton has had something to do with, especially through the Lawrence and Melton Adult Mini School. Okay, and the last challenge is, I like to call it the Revenge of Tarfon. It's based on Kedushin 40b, and in the packet, if you choose to look at it, it's the last 5 pages of an article I wrote for Religious Education in 1991, where I try to make sense of and integrate some of the work of Barry Chazan and Joe Reamer and Elliot Dorff that they had done separately about the relationship between Jewish text study and moral education. And I end up suggesting that in a way they're reacting, especially Barry, to the Kohlberg paradigm's preeminence during the 80s, and there's just everything wrong from their perspective, or many things wrong about it. And I think they've overreacted because in trying to set up this construct that they do of a study moral action dialectic, I think they forget that dialectics are by definition move in both directions. And I think a wonderful corrective to that is the present focus on service learning that's very important in the North American scene and seems to suggest that just like you can get to Ma'aseh through Limud in ways that would make Akiva very happy, you can get to Limud through Ma'aseh if you're doing really complex, well-orchestrated service learning. Okay, so you want to know about the amphibious Jew. So I'll tell you about the amphibious Jew. I'm going the wrong way again. Excuse my hampered sense of directionality. We'll get there. Okay. So who's that figure there? It's the same figure as is here. This is from our 2012-2013 Mifgash of our Cleveland teens who are part of Ambassadors for Unity, Right On for Israel. They are a wonderful group, and their Israeli counterparts. And while they were in America, the Israelis had encountered Froggy. Now, I have to say a little more about Froggy. Froggy really, for those of you who like, American trivia or arcana or stuff like that, Froggy comes from an old commercial that used to be in the United States during the 50s that I grew up with. Deb knew it was about Buster Brown shoes. And Buster Brown would get on and say, I'm Buster Brown, I live in the shoe, that's my dog Tig, he lives there too. And then a figure would come out from the background named Froggy who would say, hiya kids, hiya, hiya, hiya. Okay, that's what Froggy says. My grandchildren adore Froggy, okay? He's a sort of iconic figure, and there are our grandchildren. I'll tell you what happened to Froggy. This is part of the tale before we turn from Froggy to Steinsaltz, which, believe it or not, there's a connection. So Froggy comes to Israel last summer because we think there needs to be a light side of a very substantial and heavy and difficult Israel trip for teens, where they're meeting sides of Israel they had never encountered. They remember coming to Israel with their Agnon or their Schechter trips and going to a Bedouin tent that was all charm and romance. Then we take them to some of the unregistered cities in the Negev, and they see some poverty, and they see the international workers in Tel Aviv. This is a really tough trip for them, but a very important one. So we needed something light, so we're creating for people back in the States, for the parents of the AFU WOFI folks, an ability to follow the trip, and Froggy and Saba, Saba, he's Froggy, get photographed in different places along the way just to say, here's where the trip is going. Well, it turns out that Froggy is a big hit with the parents back home. He's not such a big hit with teenagers. It's a little funny and funky and uncomfortable. So in a pure act of Rukurian second naivete, I decide that Froggy has told me that he doesn't want to come back to Israel again. What frog wants to stay in parched lands? I mean, think about it. So he's going to make for him aliyah to the land of 10,000 lakes, Minnesota. That's a perfect environment for frogs. That's where my children and grandchildren live. So that's why Froggy made the trip, and that's where you're looking at him from. But Froggy has a serious side. I presented a little bit of this, Johnny, at the session that you were at in 2000 at the Conference on Multiple Identities, but I've been working with it since. So how do I get to Froggy? I get to him with the help of Barbara Penzner, Rabbi Barbara Penzner. Some of you, I think, may have studied with her when she was in the Amitei Yerushalayim in the early 90s. She's a really wonderful rabbi, and she writes an important article in the Journal of New Kaplanian Thought about the New Zionism, and she begins and ends the article in a really interesting way. She begins by saying she's landed in Israel and she takes off her Magan David. She explains later why that is. And she ends the article by returning to the United States 3 years later, and as she takes her first steps off the plane, she puts her Magan David back on. Those are bookends to a different experience of Jewish identity. I always thought it was interesting, but maybe a little stretched, until I find myself now swimming in the Brecha in Emek Rifaim, a beautiful pool, and my normal minhag in the States when I'm swimming in the morning is to, I daven Shachri, obviously, without tefillin. But it's important for me. It's important for my neshama, my Jewish identity, and it helps me focus my swimming, actually. So anyway, I'm not doing that now when I go swimming, and I wonder why. And it may be related to this kind of insight that we get from, in the middle of Barbara's article, she quotes what she found in a lecture in a Steinsaltz lecture in, I think, 1994 in Jerusalem. Steinsaltz argued that, first of all, that the usual distinctions among Jews, according to the Zormim that they're part of, is trivial. To say that they're Reform, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Renewal, Hasidic, doesn't make any sense. But it makes sense to make the following distinction, says Steinsaltz. All creatures live in water. The difference between sea creatures and land creatures is that land animals draw the water into themselves. Okay? So if that's a metaphor, then what I've been thinking about, and this is part of my critique of experiential learning, I think the understanding of experiential learning is surface. There's something deeper there that we would want to explore. And for me, it begins to look like this. I ask myself, what is Jewish life like when, like the fish, Judaism is the sea that surrounds us? When we are so immersed in the experience that our Jewish identity happens naturally. If you're a fan of Broadway music in the 50s, you can go to Annie, get your gun, and you can hear doing what comes naturally. So that's what the people picked up when they did this, the T-shirt, that Judaism is something you just do. And the opposite way, what is Jewish life like when, like the bear, any other mammal, and higher mammals do it differently, we have to hunt for Jewish food, water, and sustenance. I.e., if we transpose the metaphor, we have to go to our synagogues, we have to go to our JCCs, we have to go to our houses of study in order to experience Judaism. It doesn't immerse and surround us. It takes an act of kavanah. Best example, I think, of someone who was a totally mammalian Jew was my teacher Ludwig Nadelman, who taught at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, a real yekka, a very smart man. He refused to come to Israel in principle. Why? Because he thought it would be too easy. That he wanted to, this is very Germanic of him, he wanted to do everything with absolute kavanah as the perfect embodiment of the mammal, and he thought Israel would make it too easy to do the Jewish things he needed to do, so he preferred not to experience that. I would argue with Ludwig because what I think is that some of our best work in Jewish education comes when we think about what does it mean to develop an amphibious Jew, which I translate as someone who's had the sufficiently immersive experiences in Judaism, whether that comes from camp or a particular kind of restructured schooling, or from Israel, where Judaism has just wrapped them up, immersed them in an identity, and also have the virtues, which I think really are virtues, of doing things with kavanah, with thoughtfulness, out of choice. I'll show you. So when I work with the Shinshiniot who are in Cleveland, and I do a session with them about Jewish identity, the beginning of it is Ma'ikar Zahut Yehudi. What's the root of Jewish identity for you? And they respond. We have a good discussion. And then I take them through the metaphor. I ask them to think about the three distinctions between a bear, a frog, and a fish. And then we spend some time, and I ask them to prioritize these things in terms of what's difficult for them and what's easy in their life. And in the unpacking with them of that process, they seem to develop, I've done this with two groups, a real appreciation. It's a way of helping them understand what they're encountering differently in the American Jewish kids who are generally committed kids, but who experience Judaism differently and how different that is in their own Israeli Jewish identity. I think that's something, so I've utilized this as a heuristic of understanding Jewish identity and Jewish education. It's just the beginning of that exploration. And for me, part of my work over a period of time is I think the notion of alternation of experiences of immersion, which I think is far better than experiential. I agree with Dewey when we say that Jewish education needs to be experiential. We're engaging in a profound redundancy. From a Deweyan pragmatic perspective, there isn't anything except experience. It's just a useless term that way. But if we think about this alternation between immersion and reflection, which would be the gifts of a amphibious Jew, part of my project is I've always been a fan of Renat and Jeffrey Kane, who are people who have read the new research in neuroscience in a very particular way and translated it powerfully into education. So I'm thinking about experiences and how they're designed to reflect what they know and what I think we know about the nature of the learning process, that it starts with immersive experiences and moves to reflection, and that's the way the brain works. So trying to think what can be designed, built around the way the brain works and what I know. in terms of designing and generating, reshaping the experiences that are part of the values of spiritual peoplehood curriculum with an eye towards what the amphibious Jew does. So I think what I'd like to do now, I've said quite a lot, and I'm going to have to revise my plans again, because you're more than welcome to take a look at the packet at any time, and since I have appointments with any number of you, we certainly can focus in on ones that are relevant. I would like to just open it up to comments, questions, clarifications, and reserve the last 10 minutes for the She'ela Gedolah, the big question about what stage 3 of this process might be like. So, off we read.
Yeah, I just want to ask methodologically.
Okay.
No, if you would be, if it would be a contradiction.
Mark, could you raise your voice?
Absolutely. I want to ask if it would be acceptable to you to go for that last thing that you want to leave 10 minutes for, and state it now, and then we can maybe integrate our comments into that statement.
Sure.
I don't know, maybe you have your reasons.
No, I'm glad to do that. Let me just see if people have on the very top of their roast a question or a comment, and otherwise I'll do it. I think it's a good suggestion. So I will do that. Thank you, Mark. So my question is, oops, I'll just hold on to this at this point. Look, if I think of this project down the road, I'm thinking about long run, 5 years or so from now, my natural tendency, at least the part of me that has been an academic for so much a part of my career, is to produce a book. I've been really very fortunate to have either authored, co-authored, edited, or co-edited 15 different books. I like that process. But there's a part of me that still hangs on to that wonderful insight of Franz Rosenzweig that at particular times in Jewish life, on the opening of the Lehrhaus, the last thing one needs is books, and there's reasons for that for his generation. In our generation, the question for me is, if I'm doing the job I want to do, and all these foundational pieces of work are done, and the pieces that create and revive the content, is the best thing to produce a remix, as it were, of Creative Jewish Education, the 1983 volume, that then looks different because absorbed into it are these challenges and the changes? Or is that really very much thinking from the last century, or at least the last 20 years, and should I be thinking about instead producing a kind of interactive website where the key ideas and philosophical issues can be accessed, but so can the curricular products? And that feels, I am both confused in a good sense. I'm not unsettled by my confusion, but I'm very open to thinking about it in either direction. So, Jonathan?
Okay, so I think you've got a question basically of hardware and software.
Okay.
So you're producing software, which the real question is, what is the hardware? And I think that's a very, very serious question, because I think at the end of the day, your real question is, how do you ensure that your operating system is going to be used and not shelved? Mm-hmm. Am I correct? I mean, that's what the real question is. Not the question how it's going to be filed at the Hebrew University Library, but rather how's it going to make an impact for communities who are going to think about these things and it's going to be part of it. So if we frame it in that way, then the question really is a much larger question in terms of how do you perceive of educational systems who essentially the next 20, 30 years, how they're going to operate, both in a formal and informal way. Are there any very serious attempts to make this happen? And then to dovetail whatever you're doing with what is happening. Because my real fear is that both your answers are dependent on a pent-up demand, which I'm not sure really exists in reality, other than in the inner circle of people who are committed.
I got it. It's a tough challenge.
So it's a much bigger question, and it seems to me that you've invested a lifetime of thought and very serious deliberation in terms of, I think there's both a theology here, there's an education, there are a lot of things that over here which come together in terms of Reconstructionist movement. But I think the large question is, what is Reconstruction education going to look like? And when I say not look like, I'm not talking about it. Is there a serious attempt to design it in a way that it's going to be impactful in the same metaphor that you talked about, that it will be embrace the person, whatever they do, wherever they are, etc.? Because my real fear is that it doesn't exist. And if there's no serious thought as far as that is concerned, then the software won't have any hardware to carry it, result of which it just will not be utilized.
Great. Well, I know your interest in how innovations last or don't last, and the
wrong with that? It's basically.
So yeah. So, I mean, what's counterintuitive to me is that, because I don't think this is the general state of Jewish education, but somehow, and I don't think I'm being self-deluding or self-serving, that this set of materials and this approach has stood the test of time. People keep coming back to it. It hasn't been shelved. It's been renewed. But I'm not sure it will be in the future. And another key question is, I don't think this is just for a Reconstructionist audience, but what's out there, and whether this can bridge, this is what I try to do in the article in E-Jewish Philanthropy, between people who say, we've just got to throw everything away. That was, well, David Breisman didn't say that, but he said, all that counts really is the encounter and the engagement and the identity that comes. And Danny Lehman at this debate at New Cage was saying, no, the substance matters. So I try to say, elu ve'elu, but what kind of frame can sustain that? And you're raising really tough questions. Appreciate it. Other thoughts? Yeah, we'll get back.
Well, naturally, I gravitate, as Johnny and I to a certain extent complement each other. I gravitate more towards the theoretical. And I'd like to know how what you think has happened to Kaplan in the meantime. As all this has happened, in what way has Kaplan been reinterpreted, modified, not evolved, but not by Kaplan,
right?
By you. That's be interesting. Another thing I'd like to mention also about Israel, perhaps a caveat. Yes, Israel surrounds you with Jewish issues, let's call it. But I think we have to distinguish between the is and the ought. The fact that we live in a country where Jews do a lot of things, it doesn't mean that Jews are doing what they ought to do. And in Chul, Jews are using a lot of ought language, tikkun olam, and a lot of ought language. Here, there's a lot of Jewish activity, but that doesn't necessarily governed by that ought language. So that, and apart from which, the kind of things that we have to do here are very often very strongly influenced by the reality of sovereignty, of national sovereignty, which has all kinds of pluses and minuses that go with it. And whereas in the diaspora, where yes, there's Jewish community, there's Jewish peoplehood, there's Jewish, integral life and communal life, the problems, the terrible problems of sovereignty are not faced necessarily. And another question is last one. Let's say, the thing that most caught me, and that I think is real, is the tension between immersion and reflection in education. I think that's very crucial. Immersion and reflection. Going back to Mike, who to a certain extent was a disciple of Soloveitchik, he always thought, and he wrote in his doctorate already, that socialization comes before individuation, which means that immersion comes before reflection. And then the question is, what's the critical mass of immersion, whether that's deeds or texts or both, that can lead to responsible reflection? And that's you can hear where my sympathies lie. But anyway.
Well, I'm just going to be taking notes now because I'm really delighted that Svi has helped me set this up. So there's going to be follow-up conversations. But so I'm going to go to Michael, Howie, and then back to Mark for comments. And anyone else?
couple of things. First of all, to me, there's something almost oxymoronic about the term spiritual peoplehood.
Okay.
Where peoplehood, well, I understand that all these words are words that we've made up, the Jews have made up. But peoplehood is not a word in the Oxford Dictionary. And
I actually believe it is now. But anyway, go ahead.
If it is, because the Jews have probably some Jewish educator
Made a donation.
will be told he made it up. And also, Amiyut is a neologism in Hebrew, as far as I know. It's not. But for me, the notion of peoplehood, and the emphasis on peoplehood is a Zionist contribution is precisely to move away from the spiritual as defining Jewish identity. So. So that was one point there. That's sort of something that was almost a contradiction in terms to what spiritual peoplehood. And the other thing is just about Israel that follows off from what John said. That it's interesting. There's a kind of a difference of opinion in Israel, which probably predates the establishment of the state of Israel, and certainly goes on, which is to what extent is being Jewish in a Jewish Hebrew-speaking society and milieu, natural milieu, if we can use the word natural, is sufficient? That solves the problem.
Language and land.
And people within Israel who say no, that we have to worry about reflection on being Jewish and the substance of being Jewish and the content of being Jewish and the oughts of being Jewish, no less in Israel, if we're going to maintain Jewish identity in Israel, maybe in a different way, but no less than a Jew in the diaspora has to think about those things.
Thanks.
So that, for example, when they get, we have a new subject on the curriculum called Tarbut Israel, and the motivating factor behind creating that curriculum subject, which is basically a remake of about 5 or 6, 7 different sub-disciplines of that kind that have been on the curriculum over almost 100 years, is, if we don't teach the kids Tarbut Israel, they won't have Tarbut Israel.
Right.
Just by being there.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
First, you mentioned R.S. Peters, and in terms of this whole notion of this spiritual peoplehood, what would be the tension between the reason and habit? In other words, what are the habits that are trying to be taught or trying to be part of this?
Well, that's really a terrific analogy, and I think of Peter's, you reach the palace of reason through the courtyard of habit as being related to these two faces of Kaplanian thought, that on the one hand, and it's related to Rosenach, you have to acculturate to some level before you can ask the right question. So that's really worth playing with.
Where do you start here?
Yeah.
In other words, do you start from the reason, or do you start from that? And if you start from the habit, or you start from the reason, then what does
That's
that
great.
entail?
We'll talk more about that. I really
Second thing is the whole notion of ritual. And are there specific rituals which are associated with this notion of spiritual peoplehood? And you can take it in to Clifford Geertz. You can go in many different directions in terms of the power of ritual. And what is, if anything, what are the rituals that have to, if you want to create a peoplehood, I imagine, again, this may be a false assumption, that you have to have a certain basic code of, not code, you have to have certain rituals which help develop that culture in a certain direction. So what does that include? Because for me, it seems very amorphous at this point.
No, especially for American Jews, the portal to their identity is often through the synagogue and its rituals. So all of these, I mean, sort of a banner that runs through my mind, given to me by my colleague David Teutsch, is that the kitzur, the purpose of Jewish life as he understands it, is to ethicize ritual and to ritualize ethics. But whatever, and I like that for a number of different reasons, but it has to be, look, Kaplan's great contribution to Reform Judaism was to say that, and he used the language of folkways, but to say that ethical monotheism doesn't get you very far if you're looking for the life of a people. It needs to live via rituals and ceremonies. So again, that's something that it's valuable to see it through your eyes, because I assume that I say the values of spiritual peoplehood, I see the schools that have worked, I see camps, and I see what surrounds it. But it's presumably without the right explanation, you could abstract that and make it into an exercise. And this is part of Tom Green's critique of the whole notion of values, that it becomes abstract and it needs to be concretized, and ritual is part of what concretizes it, for sure. Mark and Svi, yeah.
I have a couple of comments, many comments, but there's also maybe some questions here.
Okay.
First of all, I saw in your chart, in one of your posters, you had their kedusha, and you had their embodied kedusha.
Right.
So first of all, I want to explain where my allergy and opposition
Okay.
is to the notion of spirituality, peoplehood, what we call spiritual peoplehood.
Okay.
If there's anything that I think I like about Judaism, probably the main thing I like is the whole notion of how we translate our most cherished notions of what's right and what's wrong, etc., into political, practical language. So therefore, all spirituality, in my opinion, that's worth the name of spirituality, is embodied spirituality. And I think that whole notion, now, I don't know what you think about it, I'd really be curious. There's one person I feel who can compete perhaps with the Haredim in creating the yam that you're talking about, the amphibious yam, the yam that people swim in naturally. I think the Haredim do that, by the way.
Yeah.
I don't think liberal Jews do that. But if there's one person who does that, it's Arthur Waskow. In my opinion, I'd like to hear what you say about it, because you see, no one can cast a doubt that Waskow's not spiritual. Okay? I mean, that he's not into spirituality. However, it seems to me, and I don't say I agree with his politics per se, but he's a person who takes spiritual, religious concepts and applies them to the really burning issues of both the global world, the American world, and Zionism.
He does.
So I don't really, again, I have trouble again with this whole spiritual peoplehood. Okay? Last point I'll make. I actually wrote an article, which I won't say is, anyway, I wrote an article that was published in an e-journal called The End of Jewish Education. And it's a play on, obviously, the Neil Postman, maybe not obviously, I was playing off Neil Postman's book, The End of Education, in which end has that double meaning. And basically my claim there is that Jewish education will end, or Jewish culture will end, okay, if it does not find a way of really speaking and addressing the serious, the cultural, educational, political, moral problems us humans being faced anywhere in the world, doesn't matter, and has interesting, important, exciting responses to it. And if it doesn't have that, then assimilation, as far as I'm concerned, is not a problem, it's a solution to the problem of the irrelevance of Jewish life today.
Wow.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
You mentioned just now that for American Jews, they enter Judaism through the portal of the synagogue.
Many, yeah.
It's worthwhile remembering that I don't like the word choice because I don't know what it means. But let us say it means something. They don't do that by choice.
They need a whole society working very hard not to allow for any other options that they choose to pick. And when we forget context, we're in deep trouble, and that's why Jewish liberal education is in so much trouble. The other point I wanted to make has to do with two assumptions. Let us assume that the tools, the artifacts through which reasoning is achieved are language, which I think we can agree.
Okay.
But then we have to remember that language is only achieved through practice. So I don't know what the discussion is all about. No practice, no language. Language doesn't exist by itself.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important, and I think that what Tom Green's trying to get at that and saying when we talk and use language in the abstract, it already signals a breakdown of something that we've lost. I'm not sure that Howie and I share a love that appreciates it too of philosophical inquiry, philosophy for children. Language also is alive. We couldn't do without it, and in many ways it's already embedded in experience. But when it gets shorn from experience, I think we have problems. So we'll talk more about that. Okay. So I don't feel the need to answer any of these things other than to say they're all good appointments and will be part of what we work on together. So I'm really very appreciative for your comments, and didn't leave as much time as I liked or planned for you to read or to offer, but I hope it gives us a framework. Actually hold on to these, please, just because they might be useful as we break into really pointed discussion. So, the packet. Hello, Devar.